There is a kind of silence that belongs only to history, not the silence of forgetting, but the stillness that lingers when something once strange was once so deeply believed. In a narrow wooden chamber, cloaked in candlelight and the weight of Latin prayers, a pig stands trial for murder. Not metaphorically, not symbolically, but truly, plainly, judicially, as though the law itself could reach across the boundary between beast and citizen and make its meaning known. Somewhere, beneath the carved beams and the scent of tallow smoke, a parchment has been drawn, charges written, witnesses summoned, a judge seated with solemn breath, and, at the center, a creature who cannot know its name. The pig does not understand. It does not reason. It does not remember the child it trampled underfoot or whether the child was ever there. But none of that matters, because this is not only about guilt. This is about order and fear and the need, somehow, to see the world stitched back together when it falls apart. The trial, with all its robes and ritual, is a kind of story, and in that story, the pig has a role to play. Not because it is evil, not because it chose, but because something must be held, somewhere, accountable. It is easy to laugh, centuries later, easy to hear the word trial and imagine a farce. But it wasn't. Not to them. This was sacred theater, part justice, part prayer, part trembling mirror of a world we no longer understand. They brought animals before the law not as jesters, but as vessels. Vessels for blame. Vessels for sin. In a world where the wind could turn your crops against you, where a bad omen could rot a marriage, and where the boundary between body and spirit was as thin as a breath, perhaps the pig was not just a pig. Perhaps it was an echo of something older, a shape cast by something unseen. And so the court proceeded. The bailiff stood with staff in hand. The prosecutor read his accusation. The defense, yes, the defense was sometimes appointed to speak for the creature, to plead for mercy, to explain behavior. Not because they believed the pig would speak back, but because, in some solemn and quiet way, they believed justice required the effort. Even if the subject was silent, the structure had to stand. The ritual had to complete itself, like a circle traced in the dust around a fire. In one record, from Falaise in 1386, a sow was dressed in a man's coat and executed in the public square for the crime of killing an infant. Eyewitnesses say it was hanged, its limbs bound, its face marked. The townsfolk gathered. Some wept. Others watched in awe. And though we cannot know what they thought as the creature was lifted skyward, we can almost feel what they feared, that if they did not mark this moment, if they did not speak the ritual aloud, then the world itself might forget the rules, might blur the line between human and wild, might lose the thread entirely. Was it grief, perhaps, that led them to such measures? The kind of grief that swells when life is taken suddenly, senselessly, and there is no one to blame? Or maybe it was a longing deeper than thought, to see even nature obey, to see even the wind and the hoof and the beak bow before the word of man. But what did it mean to find a pig guilty? What did guilt become when placed upon something without soul or scripture? Did it dissolve into spectacle? Or did it crystallize somewhere deep inside the collective memory as a warning that the world, in all its randomness, must never be left unspoken for? The pig never resisted. It did not plea. It did not flinch when the cords were tied. It simply existed, an animal cast into a system meant for saints and sinners. And still, the crowd remained. Still, the officials signed the records, sealed the ink, filed the parchment away. As if, one day, someone might need to know. As if someone, centuries later, might find the story and wonder, was this real? Yes, real, in the way ancient beliefs are real. Real, in the way silence is real. Real, in the way fear becomes law, and law becomes ritual, and ritual becomes memory. The pig stood there because someone believed it must, and perhaps that belief was enough. These trials were not common, but they were not rare. They echoed across Europe, France, Switzerland, Italy, each region adding its own touches. Some held solemn ceremonies. Others offered the accused animal's legal representation. There are records of rats being summoned to court for destroying barley fields, of insects being excommunicated, of dogs sentenced for crimes of disobedience. The absurdity fades the more one listens. The more one understands that absurdity is often the language of a world without control. So we ask again, what if justice once extended to the voiceless? What if guilt was not about intent, but about balance? What if these strange and quiet trials were not about crime, but about hope? The hope that someone, somewhere, was still watching. And if that's true, if that's even half true, then how many other things have we judged in silence? And yet, if this much can be lost, what else might we have forgotten? Perhaps it lingers there, in a cold little hall where dust collects between the floorboards, and where time, in its quiet stubbornness, has chosen not to clean. The wooden docks remain, not polished, not preserved, just waiting. Still waiting. As if even now, they expect someone to be brought forward. Something. Someone. A creature. Maybe a shape once feared, or a body once loved. The air in these rooms was always heavy, not with noise, but with knowing, with a breathless kind of silence that makes you feel watched, not by people, but by memory, as though the very walls remembered too much and chose to say nothing. A hen carried in a worn basket, a goat tugged along by rope, blinking as if the world had turned strange, a corpse, waxen and cold, propped like a marionette in the faint glow of torchlight. These were the accused. These were the ones who entered not with defense, but with destiny, shaped not by what they had done, but by what we believed they meant. And we, whoever we were then, we sat them at the edge of order and begged the universe to explain itself. Not because they could confess, not because guilt made sense, but because our lives, soft and vulnerable as they were, kept slipping out of control. One wrong birth, one bad harvest, one death too sudden, and the world seemed broken. So we made symbols out of animals. We placed chairs for the dead. We asked them, wordlessly, to play the role we assigned them, just long enough to make sense of what had shattered. A chicken on trial is not a chicken. It is a wound. A goat is not a goat. It is a question left unanswered. And the dead cannot speak, but their silence becomes the loudest witness of all. We summon them not to hear them, but to feel that they had been heard. In some trials, their bones were dressed in clothes. In others, they were lifted, named, and tried for heresy, or for treason, or for the shadows they left behind. And maybe that was enough. Maybe the ritual alone was the justice. Maybe it always is. We have found fragments of these moments, scattered like wind-blown leaves across the pages of forgotten court records. In faded ink, barely clinging to parchment, we read of pigs placed in the defendant's dock, of beetles who destroyed vineyards and were summoned by bell and writ to appear, of corpses declared guilty decades after death, long after the living could reply. And each time, it feels almost too strange to be true. But not because it didn't happen, because it did. And perhaps what's stranger still is how these moments drift, how they disappear not because they were buried, but because we stopped asking why they were remembered. What kind of world believed that a creature without conscience could still carry guilt? What kind of grief led us to appoint a defense for a rat, to write up a summons for an infestation? And what kind of sorrow must have haunted the family who watched a loved one condemned long after their final breath? Maybe we wanted more than closure. Maybe we wanted shape, to hold the chaos of nature or the cruelty of fate in human hands, even if just briefly. The docks, in their crude simplicity, offer that shape. A beginning, a middle, a verdict. The soft comfort of linearity. Even if the accused could not hear the charges. Even if they never understood. There's a strange beauty in it, too. Not beauty in justice, but beauty in the yearning. In the aching effort to make meaning from a world that rarely gave it freely. The wooden docks were not simply furniture. They were altars to that yearning. They held more than bodies. They held belief. And belief, when unanchored from reason, drifts into rituals we later forget how to explain. And so we find ourselves here, centuries later, peering backward through time's veil, and wondering not at what they did, but at what we no longer dare to do. We no longer put chickens on trial, but we still search for scapegoats. We still try the voiceless. We still want the world to be fair. And when it isn't, we look for someone or something to carry the weight. Could it be that in forgetting these rituals, we forgot part of ourselves? Not the part that believed in superstition, but the part that mourned without language, that reached out through absurdity just to feel less alone. And if those docks still wait, what else might be waiting with them? Perhaps a rooster, feathered and bewildered, shifting quietly in the chill of a stone hall, its claws clicking faintly against the floor, its breath forming little clouds in the morning air. The candles are already lit, low flames swaying as if they, too, are listening. Above, high windows let in a weak, holy light that filters through dust, making the space feel neither outside nor in. Not quite sacred, but not entirely secular either. This is a courtroom, yes, but it is also a chapel, a stage, a sanctum where belief becomes law and law becomes story. The rooster stands accused of laying an egg. And in this time, a time many centuries removed from ours, such a thing is no small matter. For an egg laid by a rooster is not merely strange. It is unclean. It is unnatural. It is in a world of whispered fears and unspoken teachings, something touched by the devil. A cock's egg, they call it, a cockatrice egg, to be feared not because of what it is, but because of what it could hatch. A serpent bird, a basilisk of myth, a bringer of death with a single gaze. Of course, the egg will never hatch. But that is not the point. The point is that it could have. It might have, and that is enough. The judge listens, robed in wool, face lined by candlelight and the slow erosion of years. The priest is nearby, fingers resting gently on a wooden cross. The clerk dips his pen, quietly transcribing each word in Latin. The language of courts, of faith, of finalities. The words fall like soft stones. Non licet, contra naturam, damnandus est. It is not permitted. It is against nature. It must be condemned. And the rooster still does not move. Does it hear the words? Does it feel the weight of centuries pressing into its feathers? Probably not. But in that moment, it becomes more than itself. It becomes a vessel, a shape onto which fear is poured. Not because it deserves it, not because it understands it, but because belief needs somewhere to land. And the rooster, motionless, mute, peculiar, is close enough. This is not the only bird to face such fate. Across the centuries, chickens have been tried for pecking children, geese summoned for blasphemy, even beetles accused of gluttony. Each time, the courts assemble. The prayers are read, and Latin, that sonorous, ancient tongue, fills the air like incense. Not because it must be understood by the creature, but because it must be understood by the room. Language, in these halls, is not for communication. It is for control. And yet, there is something tender in the way they proceed. The law does not rush. It does not shout. The record is written carefully, line by line. The charges are listed. The defense, when there is one, is given voice. In one case, a lawyer speaks for a colony of rats, arguing that they need more time to appear before the court due to the dangers of the journey. The court agrees. It adjourns, as if somewhere, in the fields or rafters, the rats are gathering their thoughts, readying their appeal. Maybe this is absurd. Maybe it always was. But maybe absurdity is just the skin we place on something older, something deeper, a ritual for grief or a balm for fear. A way to mark the edge where nature begins and human meaning ends. The rooster did not ask for this role, but neither did the people who feared what it might bring. All of them, perhaps, were caught in the same web of stories, of superstitions, of a world that didn't yet know how to be sure. The egg, when brought forward, is small and pale and harmless. No monster sleeps within it. No poison leaks from its shell. It is only an egg, and yet it is burned, shattered and burned in the public square, under the gaze of children and elders alike. A warning, perhaps, or a wish that the world might return to sense once again. The rooster, too, is sentenced, executed, not out of cruelty, but out of caution. Because in a world stitched together by fragile beliefs, one thread out of place can unravel the whole cloth. Better to act, they reasoned, than to risk the unknown. Still, the parchment remains, a record that someone once thought it important enough to write it down, that the rooster stood trial, that the law spoke Latin, that the egg was feared. That order, in whatever shape it took, was preserved. And centuries later, we find these pages. We read them not for judgment, but for memory, for the strange warmth of knowing that even long ago, people longed for sense in a senseless world. Could it be that the rooster's silence said more than we knew? Could it be that in the heart of all law, there's a kind of poetry, the need to name, to narrate, to tether the wild to words? And if even a bird could be summoned to court, what else might have once stood where reason could not reach? Perhaps something smaller, something hidden in the shadowed corners beneath the altar, in the hollows of old beams, or behind the draped velvet of sanctified space. The churches were never as silent as they seemed. Beneath the echo of hymns, beneath the rustle of robes and parchment, there were other sounds. Scurrying feet, gnawed grain, soft squeaks like the ticking of a living clock, invisible but never absent. Rats, not as metaphors, but as presences, as witnesses, as violations. The sanctity of the church was not merely ritual. It was order, layered and delicate, a balance held together by psalms and wax, by relics and repetition. And when that order was disturbed, even by something as small as a rat, it became more than disruption. It became desecration. These creatures, common, prolific, stubborn, could not be punished like men, nor reasoned with like saints. But they could be named, and once named, they could be addressed, excommunicated, cast out, not by trap or blade, but by the gravity of sacred words. In some villages, the clergy would gather, not to hear confessions, but to write them on behalf of the rodents. A formal writ, a curse structured like a blessing, delivered in solemn Latin with the force of divine law. The rats, of course, did not come. They never sat in the pews, never approached the pulpit, never responded when summoned. But that absence did not undo the ritual. If anything, it deepened it, made it more necessary. For if the rats would not respect the sacred, then the sacred must defend itself. Could it be, then, that this too was a form of mourning? Not for the grain eaten or the candles chewed, but for a world too porous to stay pure. The church was supposed to be a place untouched by death, by wildness, by decay. And yet even here, the outside crept in. The rats reminded them that even holiness had walls, and walls could be breached. So they were spoken to, not with malice, but with formality, as though the very shape of the ritual could restore the shape of the world. And maybe in a way it did. The priest would step into the center aisle, holding the book with reverent hands, his voice rising not in anger, but in rhythm. The congregation would listen, not out of fear of the rats, but out of reverence for the ritual, for the sense that every word spoken was a thread, weaving broken space back into wholeness. And when the excommunication was declared, it echoed, not through stone, but through memory. The rats were not killed. They were cast out, spiritually, symbolically, as if their trespass had touched something deeper than stone. In some regions, the rituals were long, careful, almost legalistic. The rats were given time to leave. They were granted notice, a window of mercy, a chance to retreat before divine judgment took hold. And if they did not, or if they did, and then returned, the excommunication was renewed. A cycle of naming and banishment, quiet and precise. A dance between presence and absence. Perhaps this was belief at its most delicate, not blind but beautiful, not desperate but devoted, a willingness to speak to the unseen, to address the indifferent, not out of delusion but out of hope. Hope that words still held meaning, that structure could stand against entropy, that even the smallest violations could be made whole through the sacred performance of care. And so the churches were not still. They pulsed with voices, not only of the faithful, but of those tasked with speaking for what could not speak. And those centuries have passed, though the stone has aged and the wood has split, something remains. An echo, a hush, the trace of incense clinging to air long since gone. We do not excommunicate rats anymore, but we still draw lines, still name intrusions, still long to believe that order, once broken, can be sung back into place. And if rats once heard the voice of the church, what else might have once listened and left? Perhaps a man, long gone, buried beneath earth and moss, pulled from silence not to be remembered, but to be tried. Not for what he did in death, but for what he once was in life. Because in some quiet corners of history, it was not enough to bury a body. The story still lingered. And where a story lingers, judgment follows. There were moments when the law reached backwards, its hands not seeking justice, but correction, to revise the script, to finish what was left unsaid. In one such moment, a corpse, pale, collapsed, and still by time, was unearthed, not for mourning, not for peace, but for punishment. He had been a traitor, they said, or a heretic, or merely inconvenient to the fragile thread of power. And so he was summoned, carried upright, placed on a chair before a tribunal of the living, dressed again in remnants of identity. His eyes could not see, but the gaze of the courtroom still fell upon him. These trials were not fiction. They are written quietly in the margins of legal histories, buried among the records like thorns among petals. Pope Formosus, in the 9th century, was famously disinterred, his corpse dressed in papal robes, and placed on trial in what came to be known, with strange theatricality, as the cadaver synod. His decaying hand was lifted by proxy to answer questions. He was found guilty. His blessings were annulled. His body was stripped and thrown into the river. Not because it made sense, but because it was necessary. Maybe not necessary in logic, but in longing. In the aching need to shape memory into something orderly, to wipe away the stain of contradiction. The dead cannot defend themselves. And perhaps that is why they were summoned, because their silence could not interrupt the story the living wanted to tell. But what does it mean to judge the dead? To render sentence on flesh that no longer feels, on bones that no longer bleed? Perhaps it means that memory itself is a kind of terrain we try to govern. That time, ungoverned, terrifies us because if the past remains unspoken, it might grow wild. It might undo what the present thinks it knows. There is something eerie in imagining it. The flicker of torchlight on a face that no longer sees. The solemnity of robes, of scrolls, of judicial silence, broken only by ritual phrases spoken into air that no longer listens. It is not cruelty, exactly. It is a performance of finality, not to hurt, but to erase, to unwrite, to declare, this man did not belong. And yet, the corpse remains, even after the trial, even after the sentence. The body, stripped of honor, remains a fact, a presence, a truth that law could not quite dissolve. Because the dead do not vanish when condemned. They linger, in whispers, in questions, in the awkward space where history tries to draw a clean line and the dust refuses to settle. Could it be that these rituals weren't only about guilt, but about the illusion of control? That in putting the dead on trial, we weren't punishing them, but trying to protect ourselves from what they left behind? The disruption, the doubt, the crack in the narrative. And perhaps there's something deeply human in that impulse, the need to wrap the story, to frame the past as neat and finished, even if the ending must be forced. We see it in every revision, every monument that leaves someone unnamed, every record that fades not by accident, but by choice. But memory does not obey. It drifts. It resurfaces, sometimes in archives, yellowed and forgotten, sometimes in song, sometimes in the hush that follows a name spoken too softly. The corpse may be buried again, but the trial, the absurdity, the sadness, the spectacle lives on. Not because it mattered to the dead, but because it revealed the living. And if a corpse could once be dressed in robes and made to answer for its life, what else might still be waiting in the ground, unheard, or above ground, just barely, blinking in the sunlight, bound at the hoof, flanked by guards in felted wool. A pig, brought not to slaughter, but to court, not for food, but for justice. At least for something we once called justice. In the soft corners of late medieval towns, where thatched roofs shed straw onto cobbled roads and bells marked time like breath, there were days when a tribunal would gather not for men, but for animals. The town crier might announce it plainly. A sow will be tried for the death of a child. Witnesses will speak. The sentence will be heard. The law, they say, must be satisfied. And so the pig is let in, not as an animal, but as something in between, a shadow of the human, wearing the weight of human wrong. It is not given rights, not really, but it is given a role, a space in the ritual, a place beneath the same high ceilings and gaze of the same cloaked judge who has ruled on land disputes and broken contracts. There is parchment, there is Latin, there is silence. To try an animal, to accuse it of intention, is to cross a boundary, not merely of species, but of imagination. It is to stretch the cloth of law until it covers the wild. Not because the pig understands, but because we do. Or at least, because we needed to believe we could. That justice could be so complete, so divine, that even the unknowing could not escape it. Maybe we hoped the cosmos was listening, that by naming every act, every tragedy, every injury, and pinning it to a body, even a beast's, we were speaking to something larger. Maybe not God exactly, but the shape of balance, the symmetry of consequence. And perhaps this is why the trials were so often elaborate. Not crude executions behind barns, but full proceedings. Sometimes the pig was dressed in clothing, placed on a stool, made to appear as if not just accused, but embodied. An echo of ourselves, distorted just enough to be judged. Not because it was a mockery of law, but because it was a performance of faith, faith that everything could be answered for if we just built the right ritual. The details linger in archives. A sow in Savigny, 1457, tried and hanged for the murder of a child. Another in Normandy, lashed in public before execution, with a glove placed on its head to mimic a hat, a marker of shame. These were not superstitions carried out in secret. These were civic events, structured, observed, remembered. To the modern eye, they seem strange, even absurd. But what if the absurdity is not in the act, but in our forgetting? What if we've lost touch with the fears these people carried? The nearness of death, the fragility of order, the loneliness of grief when no one can be blamed. A child dies. There are no enemies to name, only the pig, dumb and indifferent. And so it becomes the vessel, not because it is guilty, but because it is there. In trying it, we speak aloud our longing for coherence, for stories with causes and effects, for a world where nothing happens without reason. The pig does not speak, but it listens in its own way. Through our ritual, not its senses. Through our solemnity, not its awareness. It becomes the mirror, and like all mirrors, it reflects more of the viewer than the viewed. Could it be, then, that these trials were not for the animals at all? That they were for us, to prove that justice still held shape, even when the world did not? That we could name tragedy, wrap it in form, and bury it with ceremony? Maybe, maybe not. But the records remain. The names, the dates, the witnesses, and the verdicts, often written in the same hand that recorded royal decrees and church doctrine. The pig was judged, not as a joke, but as a node in the larger system, a shadow within the tribunal, a citizen, if only for a moment, if only to be condemned. And if a pig could stand beneath the same law as a man, what else might we have once believed was capable of guilt? The calendar did not care. It moved forward, page by page, feast day to feast day, and on certain mornings, marked by a red ink no brighter than dried berries, it bore a single word: execution. The town would already know. Word traveled softly then, like smoke from one hearth to the next. Someone would mention it at the well. Someone else would light a candle, not just for the soul of the condemned, but for the world that allowed such endings. And beneath the sky, which never blinked, never turned away, the scaffold would be prepared. It wasn't always grand. Sometimes it was barely more than a beam and a rope, set near a field's edge, where the grass had already learned how to lean away from footfall. Other times, it stood in the heart of the square, tall and grim, casting a long morning shadow across cobblestones that had seen too much. The executioner, faceless in most memory, came not as a villain, but as a function. His blade was not anger. His rope was not wrath. He was a punctuation mark, the closing silence at the end of the law's long sentence. Some feared him. Others pitied him. Few envied him. Fewer still remembered his name. And yet, even he followed ritual, especially when the condemned was not a man, but an animal. It seems impossible now, the notion that a sow, or a bull, or even a dog could be paraded through the streets with the solemn gravity of a human criminal. That bells might toll. That guards might flank. That children might peer from shutters, half curious, half scared, clutching little icons in trembling hands. What happened? It was real, not because it made sense, but because it was believed, not because justice required it, but because grief had nowhere else to go. And so, the rope swung, for the pig that trampled, for the dog that bit, for the imagined serpent curled in a malformed egg. The swing was the same. The silence afterward, deeper still. In the archives of Falaise, in Normandy, they speak of one such sow, condemned for killing an infant, dressed in a man's jacket before being led to the gallows. A strange courtesy, perhaps, or a final mark of mockery. But maybe it was neither. Maybe it was ceremony, a way of acknowledging that this creature had been made part of our world, and now, like any of us, must be made to leave it. There is something haunting about a sentence carried out on something that never knew it stood trial. The body swings, but the soul, if there ever was one, remains untouched, unaware, unmoved. And in that gap, that aching space between judgment and understanding, we find something deeply human. A need to restore balance, even if it means striking against the wind. Execution, then, was not about the creature. It was about the crowd, the watchers, the recorders, the scribes who would write the sentence not as tragedy, but as fulfillment. Justice had been done, even if it had not been understood. And perhaps that is the quiet tragedy of these rituals. Not the rope or the blade or the fire, but the belief that without them, the world would fall further into chaos. That if the sentence was not carried out, the calendar would break. The seasons would slip. The soil would forget how to yield. So we carried out the sentence, again and again, not because it was right, but because it was rhythm, not because the law demanded it, but because the silence that followed was the only kind we knew how to live with. And if the calendar once made room for a creature's execution, what else might it have held, unspoken, between its lines? Perhaps the slow stain of rot, not sudden but patient, creeping in like fog along the edges of certainty. Not a scream, but a soft undoing. Mold on grain, larvae in fruit, worms beneath the roots. A quiet undoing of the things we thought were ours to keep. The harvest failed, and the fields told no stories. Only silence and shriveled stalks. There were no enemies in sight. No soldiers' boot prints, no thunder of hooves. Only insects, invisible until they weren't, and fungi, blooming like soft curses. And in a world where survival was measured in seasons, in sacks of flour and fingers of cheese, this kind of loss was not just misfortune. It was a betrayal, an offense. And so we did what humans have always done when faced with the unanswerable. We gave it a name. We called the locusts together. We summoned the beetles. We addressed the weevils and the worms. We spoke aloud to mildew as if it might respond. And then, in solemn procession, we held trial. There are records, fragile as the parchment they were written on, of courts convened to accuse swarms and plagues. The locusts in Lausanne, Switzerland, were summoned by writ. The rats in Autun, France, were granted legal counsel. The worms in Bern were called before the bishop's seat. These were not metaphors. These were declarations, formed in the language of law and wrapped in ritual. The creatures were tried, in absentia, for trespassing against the land, for spoiling the goods of man, for stealing what could not be spared. Not because we believed they would come, not because we thought they would obey, but because we needed the ceremony. We needed to feel seen by the heavens, to prove that we had not remained idle, to act not against nature, but within a story where rot could be named, where loss could be litigated, where ruin could be rebuked, and something like justice could be traced into the ash. The priest stood before the altar, robes heavy with purpose, voices slow with incantation. The land was blessed. The air was scolded. The pests were told to leave, not as invaders, but as tenants in violation. The soil, by these rites, became not just ground, but a contract. And violation of that contract required a reckoning. Maybe we feared more than hunger. Maybe what haunted us wasn't the worm, but the message it carried. That nothing lasts. That every wall, every granary, every carefully hoarded hope would, in time, be eaten away. That no matter how many prayers we stitched into the seams of our lives, there would always be soft mouths in the dark, turning plenty into powder. And so we answered with law, with ritual, with the same solemnity we gave to men who killed and women who stole. The blight was called a sinner. The worms were called witnesses. The famine became a courtroom. And for a moment, perhaps, we felt less powerless. It's strange to imagine now, parchment curling in the corners, ink faded to the shade of old breath, reading that the caterpillars were excommunicated, that the mildew had been cursed, that the beetles were asked, gently and formally, to leave. But maybe the strangeness is not in them, but in us, in our forgetting, in the distance we've placed between ourselves and the rituals that once made the world feel explainable. Could it be that these trials were not foolishness, but fragments of something older? A time when everything had spirit, when even ruin was believed to have ears, when justice was not about punishment, but about restoring harmony to a song that had slipped out of tune. Maybe the worm never listened. Maybe the rot didn't care. But the people did. And in speaking, in writing, in accusing, they reminded themselves that they still had a voice. That even in the face of silence, the kind that comes when grain blackens and children go hungry, they could still speak, still hope, still believe that the universe might respond. And if even decay could be called to court, what else have we tried to put on trial just to feel less alone with the truth of loss? Perhaps not just animals or insects or rot, but the shape of the world itself, how it bends, how it slips, how it resists our desire to hold it still. In those strange and solemn trials of the medieval world, we see not only what frightened them, but how they dreamed. Each courtroom, each parchment-stamped verdict became something more than justice. It became a mirror, not for truth, but for longing, not for guilt, but for pattern. We didn't try the pig because it was dangerous. We tried the pig because something in us needed the illusion that the universe could be persuaded to make sense, that its accidents could be traced like veins through marble and turned into stories. A child dies, and the world reels. But with a trial, with robes and witnesses, and a verdict scratched in ink, the chaos collapses into cause. And cause, even if misplaced, feels gentler than chance. The courtroom was never just a place of judgment. It was a stage where we rehearsed our understanding of the world, where we pretended, if only for a morning, that the rules held, that good could be named and evil could be punished, even when it wore feathers or fur. These were not legal performances for logic's sake. They were rituals of reassurance. Each trial was a soft prayer in disguise, a way to say, we still know where the boundaries lie. But what if the boundaries were never real? What if they were drawn in chalk, and the rain came, and we kept pretending we could still see them? To accuse an animal, to summon a swarm, to condemn a corpse. None of it was about the creature. It was about us, about our reflection. Because somewhere between the absurd and the sacred, we saw ourselves, in the silence of the sow, in the defiance of the beetle, in the stillness of the dead. And we asked questions we couldn't speak aloud. What am I responsible for? What haunts me when no one is to blame? Where does guilt go when it has no voice? So we turned to mirrors, not the polished ones, but the ritual ones, made of laws and chants, and softly flickering candles. And we told stories through those mirrors about justice. Stories that soothed more than solved. Stories that bound the inexplicable to the visible world. Maybe we knew, even then, that these reflections were warped. Maybe we knew that the pig could not sin, that the worm could not confess. But belief doesn't always need truth. Sometimes it just needs shape. And shape was what these trials offered. The quiet comfort of defined lines, even when drawn around shadows. And perhaps that is why the absurdity never broke them. Because the absurd was the point. It was the language of grief when words failed. It was the form given to fear. It was how we mapped the invisible tremors of life into names, punishments, and resolutions. The trial was not about crime. It was about cosmology, about locating ourselves in a trembling universe. Could it be that every courtroom was, in its own way, a miniature version of the cosmos? A fragile diagram of how we wish the world worked, with cause and consequence, with balance and breach, with guilt and absolution. Not because it truly worked that way, but because to believe it did was a kind of survival. And now, centuries later, when we find these fragments, trial records curled like old leaves, verdicts inked by candlelight, we laugh, or we wince, or we wonder how they could have believed such things. But perhaps the deeper question is not how they believed, but what we now reflect, and how. What mirrors do we still use, hidden in plain sight, to make sense of senseless things? And if every courtroom was a mirror, how many of them have we looked into and mistaken for truth? Or worse, mistaken for permanence? There's a tenderness in the act of naming guilt, not because it's soft, but because it's human. To accuse is to reach for shape, to try and draw a border around something that frightens us. But when we place that guilt upon creatures without language, upon the slow breath of oxen or the flick of a donkey's ear, what were we really trying to hold in place? The language of the court was careful, ancient, rooted in Latin, laced with rituals passed through generations like heirlooms. But those words, plaintiff, accused, transgression, sentence, they were never meant for hooves or snouts. They hung in the air like garments that did not fit, tailored for a body that had never existed. And yet, the animals were made to wear them, quietly, completely, as if the mere act of dressing them in our guilt made the world cleaner. An ox in the dock does not speak, but it listens in its own way, not to the words, but to the rhythm of footsteps, the cold pause of breath, the silence that falls just before a verdict is read. And maybe beneath its rough hide, it feels something pass through it. Not understanding, not recognition, but a weight nonetheless. The weight of being seen, the weight of being named. There is a record, one among many, of a mule put on trial for kicking its handler. The town was small, the courthouse more of a chamber than a hall. Still, they brought forth the mule, tethered it in the square, and let the townspeople speak. Some said it had a wildness in its eyes. Others swore it had always been gentle, until that day. The verdict came with dusk. The mule was guilty. It was hanged at sunrise. Could justice ever truly land on the back of such a creature? Or were we only echoing our own brokenness? Maybe we weren't punishing the animal, but performing for a higher silence. A silence we hoped would see the ritual and spare us the same fate. Guilt, when placed on an animal, becomes something spectral. It has no voice, no protest, no apology. It moves like fog across the pasture, visible only in the reactions of others, in the shamed eyes of the farmer, in the trembling of the young who watch the trial, in the unease that lingers even after the body is gone. And yet we continued, not because the law required it, but because belief did. Because some part of us feared that if we did not complete the ritual, if the creature was not tried, not judged, not marked, the wound it caused would fester without meaning. That guilt would drift, unanchored, and return to us in some other form. A spoiled crop, a stillborn child, a fire in the night. So we gave it a shape. We handed it a name. We placed it on 4 legs and looked it in the eyes. The ox stood still. The donkey did not flinch. The goat chewed quietly as the charges were read. They did not carry guilt the way we meant it, but they carried something else, a kind of symbolic gravity, a tether between the world we lived in and the one we longed to believe we could control. Is it possible that, in these trials, we were not so much trying animals as trying our own inability to forgive fate? That the hooves in the courtroom, the bones in the noose, were simply mirrors for the parts of ourselves we could not bear to punish directly? Maybe, maybe not, but the sentences remain, etched in records, sealed in wax, fading now under the slow erosion of time. No apology came from beasts, no confessions, and yet the guilt passed through them anyway, like wind through straw, like breath through winter branches. And if the law once wrapped itself around fur and bone, what other names might we have spoken, just to hear the sound of order echo back? Perhaps not names at all, but signs, glimpses of movement in the corners of vision, scratching beneath floorboards, rustling in sacks of barley and rye. The tiniest shapes flickering like omens. Mice. Not monsters, not men. Just mice. Small and soft, and yet everywhere. They arrived as if summoned, not in armies, but in whispers. A squeak, a trail of droppings, the hollowed-out husk of a stored seed. They didn't roar or announce themselves. They simply appeared and multiplied and stayed, until the barns were not only ours, and the granaries spoke in riddles, and the fields no longer yielded what they once did. And in their wake came sickness, a slow, sticky fever, a cough that turned wet, a child who did not wake, then another, then more. It was not clear, not then, that the mice were messengers, not of malice, but of imbalance, of filth, of closeness, of what happens when too many gather and the world beneath them frays. But the people, kneeling beside cold hearths and warm corpses, needed someone to blame. Something. And so the smallest were named. Not the winds that turned the leaves too late. Not the winters that lingered. Not the rats or fleas or bacteria whose presence no eye could see. But the mouse. The soft-bodied witness. The one who nibbled at the boundary between home and hunger. They were summoned. With writs, in Latin, with dates and ink and seals. The mice of this parish, this village, this stretch of cursed farmland, were ordered to appear. And when they did not, as they never did, they were condemned in absentia, banished, exiled, tried for their crimes against the grain, against the peace, against the fragile rhythms of rural life. Was it foolish? Maybe, but maybe not. Maybe it was metaphor, made sacred. Maybe it was an old echo of a deeper memory, of a time when every creature had spirit, when every shadow had meaning, when a mouse was not just vermin, but a sign, a crack in a pattern, a warning stitched in fur. Because plague was never just illness. It was confusion. It was collapse. It was silence where there should have been laughter, stillness where a cradle should have rocked. And into that silence, we poured names. We created roles. We built courts, even for creatures that scurried in the dark. In some records, the proceedings were elaborate. Lawyers appointed. Clergy involved. Entire congregations gathered in prayer as the words were spoken. Formal, deliberate, weighty. That the mice should leave. That they were no longer welcome. That they had broken an unspoken covenant and must now depart or face the full sentence of divine and civic wrath. And though the mice did not listen, something shifted, not in the barns, but in the people, in the belief that they had not been passive, that they had resisted, that the plague had been answered, even if only in performance. Perhaps it was never about the mice at all. Perhaps the plague, like guilt, needed a costume. Could it be that we looked to the smallest shapes because they were manageable? Because they could be seen, chased, imagined away? Could it be that in punishing mice, we were trying to mend something far greater? The fragile bridge between ourselves and nature, broken by hunger, fear, and time? Maybe, maybe not. But the records remain. Yellowed, brittle, quietly serious. Proof not of ignorance, but of yearning. To understand, to control, to endure. And within those pages, we see the law flexing, bending, reaching beyond its grasp. Into the haystacks, into the corners of the chapel, into the darkness between two coughs. And if the mouse could stand accused for the spread of death, what else have we tried to exile, just to believe we are still in charge of our own survival? Perhaps memory itself, not the clean, polished kind that fits neatly into song or scripture, but the wild memory, the flickering one, the kind that grows in rumor, in whispers passed from doorway to grave, the kind that stains rather than sings. There were trials, quiet ones, held not in daylight, but in the fading gray that comes before forgetting. Trials without breath, without testimony, trials for the dead. Not the public ceremonies of disinterred popes or sows hanged in cloth, but stranger things still, where guilt did not live in flesh but in legacy. And legacy, once called into question, can haunt more cruelly than any ghost. The accused had already died, perhaps months ago, sometimes years. Their hands no longer stirred the pot, or penned letters, or held the reins of office. Their voice no longer stirred the air. And yet, the townspeople gathered. The elders wrote their decrees. The church lit its candles, because though the body was gone, the damage, real or imagined, remained. Some had been tyrants, others merely inconvenient. Some had made decisions in war or wealth or worship that lived on long after their eyes had closed. And others were never accused of anything in life, until someone realized it was easier to put a rumor on trial than a living man. There's a kind of silence that only the dead can hold, the kind that does not respond, does not defend, does not confess. And in that silence, all stories expand. The dead, after all, are pliable. Their narratives can be pressed like wax, shaped like clay. They cannot correct. They cannot cry out. And so they were summoned. Their names, not their bodies, were dragged back into the light. Records revisited. Accusations written as if time itself could be turned backward. Sometimes their heirs stood in their place, unsure whether they were defending honor or simply standing as effigies for a wound no one wanted to admit was still open. What were we doing in those moments? What were we seeking? Not justice, perhaps, but permission. Permission to revise the past, to make sense of something that still sat awkwardly in the soul of a town or the corner of a chapel. We did not put the dead on trial to punish them. We put them on trial to tame them, to reclaim what had been left messy, incomplete, unresolved. Could it be that in judging the dead, we were attempting to exhume certainty? The French called it procès posthume, posthumous trial, and the echoes stretch far, from medieval councils to revolutionary purges, from monarchs stripped of titles and death to bones condemned for heresy centuries after burial. Sometimes they ended in desecration, a symbolic purging of reputation. Other times, the record was rewritten, the name struck out, the title revoked, the tomb defiled, not because it changed the past, but because it quieted the present, or so we believed. But memory has its own tides. It resists erasure. It nests in the corners of villages, in the pauses between family names. The dead do not speak, but they are never silent. They linger in rumor, in architecture, in the unfinished songs of a generation. No trial can banish that entirely. And maybe that was the fear. Not just that someone had sinned, but that they had done so in a way we could no longer reach. That their choices lived on, like shadows without bodies, and all we had left was ritual. A paper judgment, a public shaming, a symbolic act made not for justice, but for reassurance. What if justice in those moments was not a process, but a balm, a way to settle the dust of the past so that the present could breathe again? And if a rumor could summon a trial, what else might still be waiting, unspoken, just beneath the threshold of forgetting? Maybe something not quite real, but not quite imagined either. The kind of truth that exists only when dressed in ritual. And perhaps that's all these trials ever were. Rituals disguised as reason, stories wrapped in scrolls and seals, a kind of performance meant not to persuade the mind, but to soothe the soul. Because what else were these spaces, these wooden chambers and cloister halls, if not theaters? The kind where nothing is acted, but everything is staged. The judge enters in his robes, the scribe wets the tip of his quill, the accused, whether pig or corpse or phantom mouse, stands where someone tells them to stand. And the audience, the townspeople, the clergy, the curious child peeking through the back door. They all watch. Quiet. Waiting. Not for truth, but for conclusion. For closure. It wasn't about the verdict. Not really. It was about the moment the bell stopped ringing. The moment the parchment was signed. The moment the sentence, absurd or not, was delivered with calm finality, as if the universe itself had briefly agreed to make sense. Maybe we knew the trial would not change the weather, would not banish the locusts, would not bring the dead back or keep the next child from coughing in the dark. But still it felt necessary. We drew boundaries where there were none, gave names to fears too wide for words. When we stitched our robes, we were weaving ourselves into the script. When we bowed, we were not bowing to justice, but to something older, something invisible. Perhaps it was God, or guilt, or simply the unyielding quiet of not knowing. And in that space between not knowing and needing to act, the courtroom was born, not just as a room of law, but as a sacred stage, a liminal space, a place where the living tried to speak to forces they couldn't see, fate, grief, misfortune, through the bodies of pigs, the whispers of the dead, the scratching of unseen pests. The accused was never the point. The performance was. Could it be that these trials were prayers in costume? That the robes and scrolls were no different from cassocks and candles? That law, in those moments, wasn't just a tool, but a spell, meant not to govern the world, but to protect us from it? We don't often think of justice as an act of devotion, but in these trials it was. Not devotion to fairness or balance, but to ritual, to the fragile hope that there was still a pattern somewhere beneath the chaos. That someone, or something, was still listening. Even the absurd had rhythm. There were rules for how to try a rat, procedures for addressing worms, appeals for absent weevils, and that rhythm, repeated enough, became sacred, like the rhythm of chants, like footsteps in a nave, like the quiet unfolding of a liturgy spoken for ears that may or may not hear. And maybe that was enough. Maybe the trials were never meant to work. Maybe they were only meant to hold the panic, to hold the questions, to hold the unbearable weight of knowing that sometimes suffering has no culprit. Sometimes life decays without reason, and we are left to perform our grief before an audience of silence. It's easy now to call it spectacle, to see the record of a goat in chains or a rooster excommunicated and smile with disbelief. But what if we're still doing it? What if we still wear robes and gather in solemn spaces, not always to reach the truth, but to feel less alone with our not knowing? And if the courtroom was never just a room, what else in our world is sacred only because we act as though it is? Maybe the page, not the page itself, but what we let it carry, what we trust it to remember. Because in the age before microphones and court recorders, before bureaucracies had archives to drown in, it was the scribe who made the world permanent, or at least gave it the illusion of permanence. They sat quietly, these scribes, backs hunched beneath cloisters and crossbeams, their hands ink-stained and steady. While judges spoke and priests intoned and witnesses stammered, the scribe wrote. Always behind, never heard. But their quills were the bridge between the act and its echo. Without them, nothing was fixed. Without them, the goat's trial never happened. The rooster was never summoned. The corpse was never judged. It was their pen that gave absurdity its scaffolding, their script that turned ritual into record. And the ink, dark and patient, curled across parchment like breath. Latin, mostly cold, formal, detached, and yet, in its loops and flourishes, you can feel the human behind it. You can almost see the moment of pause, the brief hesitation before writing that a chicken was condemned for witchcraft, that a beetle was sentenced to banishment. Did the scribe flinch? Did they smile? Or did they believe? Perhaps they believed. Not because the tale made sense, but because belief was never about sense. It was about duty, about rhythm, about inscribing the world as it had been performed. And yet, in the margins, sometimes there are birds. Little drawings, sometimes crude, sometimes careful. Roosters sketched beside trial records, their combs exaggerated, their claws sharp. Not because it was necessary, but because it lingered. a part of the story that would not rest with words alone. The crow that cawed once during testimony. The pigeon that fluttered into the rafters mid-sentence. Maybe they were not defendants. Maybe they were witnesses. Or maybe they were just passing through, unaware that their presence had been recorded, that they had become part of the page. Could it be that the scribes, in their long and lonely task, began to see everything as part of the trial? That the feather that landed near their ink pot was not accident, but omen? That the rhythm of the crow's cry outside the window was testimony, too? We know so little of who they were. Their names are rarely mentioned, but their hands shaped how we remember. They chose when to write deliberatum est and when to underline a sentence. They decided whether a creature was called ferox, fierce, or merely nocens, harmful. They knew how to build a sentence that sounded heavier than the act it described, how to make guilt drip from a clause, how to give silence a signature. And in their decisions, entire centuries of belief were preserved, not because they meant to deceive, but because they wrote down what they saw, or what they were told, or what the law required them to see. And now, when we read their work, in libraries, in archives, through glass that protects what fingers must not touch, we hear not just the events, but the atmosphere, the fear beneath the ink, the ritual in the structure, the quiet nod to mystery, even as they wrote in the language of law. Sometimes they copied from older records, tracing the same letters as the scribe before them, inheriting not just the words, but the worldview. And like a candle passed from one to another, the flame stayed lit, even as the hands changed, even as the absurd hardened into precedent. And perhaps that is what haunts us now, that the quill did not question, that the absurd was not laughed at, that what should have faded was instead preserved, because the scribe believed the ink was sacred. And once written, the story stayed. But maybe, just maybe, in one of those trial books, hidden between two judgments, there's a note. A brief, quiet rebellion. A sentence the scribe slipped in not for law, but for time. Something like, "Let no one say this was ordinary." And if every feather defendant left behind an echo in ink, what echoes have we preserved without even knowing what they truly meant? Maybe the echo of belief itself. Not the loud kind that declares, but the quiet kind that assumes. That waits. That weighs silence and calls it evidence. Before fingerprint powders, before blood types, before the magnifying glass found its way into detective novels and then into courts of law, there was only presence. Not presence as proof, but presence as possibility, as suspicion. A pig standing too near the scene. A rooster that crowed when it shouldn't have. A cow that wandered through a field the night before a death. The world was full of signs, and all we had were our eyes and our stories. No one spoke of motive. They spoke of omen, of shadow, of timing. If the child was found with hoof prints nearby, then guilt had already begun to bloom. Not because it made sense, but because it made something. A structure, a shape. And in a time when explanations were rare, shape was everything. There was a kind of poetry to this kind of justice, a rhythm of cause and effect, not drawn from logic, but from ritual memory. The same stories passed down in barns and bread lines and bell towers. Stories of beasts who knew too much, of hens that laid cursed eggs, of goats whose eyes seemed too human. Not because they truly did, but because fear sharpens the edges of vision. And the law followed that vision, not with skepticism, but with solemnity. Trials were held, not because the accused could speak, but because silence, too, can be placed on the scales. A rooster who crowed thrice at midnight. A sow who didn't flinch when the priest entered the pen. These were not just observations. They were judgments waiting to be written. Could it be that we wanted the guilt to be there, somewhere close, somewhere physical, not distant or divine, but within reach? Something to see, something to point to, because when grief has no name, it festers. But when guilt is placed, even wrongly, the wound closes just enough for life to continue. And so he measured presence like it was testimony. If the dog was in the village on the night of the fire, it must have seen something. If the bird circled the roof before the death, it must have known. No feathers were tested, no blood examined. But the stories were thick with meaning, and they lingered in the minds of those who listened. We forget now that belief can be its own kind of science, not the science of measurement, but of pattern, of intuition, of accumulated tales. Generations of watching the way animals behave, or seem to behave, at the edge of something tragic. Maybe it wasn't stupidity. Maybe it was its own kind of wisdom. Flawed, yes, but intimate, earnest, made not of data, but of dread. Even the scribes, those steady chroniclers of ink and dust, sometimes wrote with the heaviness of conviction, not evidence. The rooster was found roosting atop the chapel roof after the theft. That was enough. Enough to name, to try, to sentence. Because the rooster was there. And sometimes being there was guilt enough. Not because the rooster knew, but because we didn't. Because when the world turned strange, when crops failed, or children didn't wake, or illness rode in on wind and sweat, we needed something to hold, something to tether meaning to. So we reached for what was closest, and the pig, the dog, the bird, they became anchors, symbols of a larger fear we couldn't put into words. There was no intent, no defense, no examination of evidence. There was presence, there was story, there was belief, and that was enough. And maybe in some quiet, aching way it still is. And if the scales once tipped at the sound of a crow's wing, what else have we named guilty, simply because we were too afraid to be alone with the silence? Perhaps the sky itself, that vast and voiceless dome that gives and takes without explanation, that breathes seasons into our lives and sometimes rage. There were times across the old calendars of Europe when the clouds rolled in too soon, when the rains did not stop, when the sun left for weeks or arrived too early, burning the wheat before it ripened, when hailstones fell in heaps like curses. Not one, not two, but thousands. Hard and sudden, shattering windows, stripping orchards, flattening barley in the hour before harvest. And no one to blame, no one to confront. And so they blamed the wind, blamed the clouds, the thunder, the storm that cracked the chapel roof and drowned the lambs. They called it theft. They called it offense. And somewhere between desperation and ritual, they wrote the weather into the language of guilt. Not because they misunderstood nature, but because they remembered a time, or imagined one, when the heavens could still be reasoned with, when the skies had ears, when storms were not senseless, but sentient. And so they put the elements on trial, literally. In some parts of France and Switzerland, communities gathered not only to pray for the end of a storm, but to rebuke it. Formally, legally, the clergy stood in their robes, reading out writs of excommunication, not for heretics, not for animals, but for hail, for wind, for destructive rain. The words were precise, echoing the same structures used for human trials. The storm was summoned, given notice, warned, and then condemned. It sounds strange to us now, this notion of cursing the sky like a thief, of banning cloud from a parish line. But perhaps it wasn't so strange. Perhaps it was another kind of justice, drawn not from reason, but from yearning. The yearning for control, for rhythm, for fairness in a world that often offered none. Because when the fields fail and the river floods and the trees do not fruit, something in us begins to look upward, not with science, but with sorrow, and sometimes with blame. Could it be that these trials were not acts of ignorance, but of intimacy? That those who lived with the land, whose lives beat to the rhythm of frost and thaw, spoke to the sky not out of foolishness, but out of relationship? The kind of relationship that aches when it breaks. And so they spoke in the only way they could, through ritual. The excommunication of hail might not stop the storm, but it reminded the people that they were not powerless, that the sky had been named, that someone had spoken the pain aloud, and maybe, just maybe, the clouds listened, or maybe they didn't. But the record remains. In old archives, there are letters from bishops declaring the skies unjust, scrolls with seals pressed into wax, marking the banishment of a particular weather over a particular field. Witnesses swore the storms came from the east. Others said it was punishment for someone's hidden sin. But the court didn't always care why. It cared what? What was lost? What was damaged? what could no longer be repaired. And in naming the wind a criminal, it gave shape to that loss. We don't summon the clouds to court anymore. We measure them, track them, predict them. But perhaps something has been lost in that exchange. Not knowledge, but reverence. The kind of reverence that dared to believe the sky might answer back. Because belief, after all, isn't always about power. Sometimes it's about proximity, about needing the world to feel close enough to touch, even when it hurts us. And if once we excommunicated the storm, what else have we tried to banish from the heavens, just to believe the earth still loved us back? Perhaps nothing so grand as the sky, but smaller things, stranger things. The creeping rustle in the night, the unusual birth, the twitch in a dying man's eye. These too unsettled us, and without answers, we reached for structure, for story, for names. There is something deeply human in the tension between fear and form. That flickering space where the unknowable brushes against the edges of understanding. In that space, we invented law, not to mirror the world as it was, but to tame it into something we could bear. The trials we remember now as absurd. The pig in the dock, the beetle summoned by writ, the goat condemned in its stillness. These were not acts of mockery. They were attempts, earnest, uneasy attempts to bring the chaos of life into a pattern. A sentence, a scroll. They were less about punishment and more about containment. Maybe that's why they feel both foolish and familiar. Because they began, always in that childhood instinct, to name the thing that frightens you. To give it a form, a label, a place in the story. The monsters under the bed became witches. The plague became rats. The hail became judgment. And once named, they could be dealt with, or at least addressed. And in addressing them, we stitched law into belief. These trials were not wild. They were structured, timed, filed away in neat Latin. They mirrored human procedure, not by accident, but by design. As if by dressing the irrational in robes of reason, it might begin to obey. The swine was assigned counsel. The rat was summoned 3 times before it could be excommunicated. The weevil was given a chance to depart peacefully. The form mattered more than the outcome. Because form is what we cling to when sense begins to unravel. We think of superstition as the opposite of structure, but what if it's just its root? What if beneath every system lies a small trembling, a flicker of fear that the world does not care for our order? And so we build cathedrals and code and courtrooms. We place the world in categories, but the old fears remain, moving like wind between the stones. In the trial records, there's often a calmness that masks the tremor underneath. The rooster crowed 3 times on the day of the theft. This is noted without embellishment. The dog howled outside the gate the night the bishop fell ill, written plainly, as if the act itself explained everything. And maybe it did, not because it proved anything, but because it gave the fear a direction. Could it be that the law, in its earliest shape, was never about justice, but about comfort? About reassuring ourselves that there was something we could do, even when faced with what we could not understand. The line between law and lore is thinner than we think. A beast that speaks in dreams, a shadow that crosses a churchyard, a cold wind that precedes disaster. All of these were stories once, but when written down, they became records. And when entered into records, they became precedent. And when precedent piled upon precedent, we called it law. Not because it was truth, but because it was safer than silence. And in that silence, we remembered things we weren't supposed to, the flickering of the old gods beneath the new ones, the shape of the forest before the roads, the feeling that something was always watching, just out of sight. Maybe we put animals on trial not because we believed they were guilty, but because we sensed that the world itself was alive in ways we couldn't explain. And once you believe that, you must also believe it can be reasoned with, or at least held accountable. And so, between superstition and order, we found space. A liminal courtroom, where language held back the dark for just a little while longer. And if law once arose from fear disguised as form, what else have we built, believing it would protect us, when all it really offered was the comfort of being heard? Perhaps a boundary, a rule, a path carved into soil by agreement, not by nature. Because when the trial ended, when the verdict was spoken and the scrolls sealed with wax, the story didn't stay in the courtroom. It leaked into hedgerows, into prayers, into the way neighbors looked at each other across the market square. Justice, even when misplaced, left a mark. A pig condemned for the death of a child wasn't just a sentence. It became the thing the village remembered, a before and an after. Children were told not to play near the mill pond anymore. A new fence was raised behind the bakery, not because of the pig, but because something had to change. The widow who owned the pig lost more than livestock. She lost quiet. People passed her differently now. Her doorstep no longer gathered shoes. And in this way, the verdict traveled, not on parchment alone, but in posture, in silence, in the slight tightening of the world around the guilty, even when the guilt had no voice. Especially when it had no voice. Could it be that these strange trials mattered less for their justice and more for their direction? They told the village where the danger had been. Whether real or not, the danger had been named. And in naming it, the people reoriented themselves around it. They mapped their grief on a geography. In some places, boundary stones were moved. An animal's offense, or the belief in its offense, became reason to redraw who could graze where, who could walk which road at dusk, who could be trusted with a key. The sentence was symbolic, but the consequences were not. They were logistical, political, quietly structural. And it wasn't just animals. The ghost trial of a disgraced merchant might lead to the disbanding of his guild. The symbolic banishment of a swarm of beetles could shift farming practices in the region. And sometimes, without realizing it, the village changed its shape entirely, as if the act of judgment carried tectonic force. These verdicts shaped memory, too. A pig hanged in 1474 might echo for generations as more than a punishment. It became a parable. People said, "This is the road where it happened." Or, "My grandfather was there, and he said the pig did not struggle." It became a kind of folklore, written not in fable, but in civic memory. And folklore, once seeded, blooms quietly in the cracks of a village's foundations. And perhaps this is how societies truly evolve, not only through invention, but through caution, through rituals that feel absurd in hindsight, but made sense at the time, not because they solved anything, but because they gave the illusion of stability. Maybe not. But when archaeologists uncover the remnants of old villages, they often find the layers of change, the shifting of fence posts, the realignment of gates, the sudden abandonment of wells or alleyways. The why is rarely recorded, but perhaps somewhere in that missing space there was a trial, a verdict, a moment when someone or something was named the cause of something too heavy to carry alone. And so the village moved, just slightly, just enough to forget. Justice leaves no fossils, but its consequences do. And if a verdict against a pig could reshape a village's footpaths, what else might be buried in the shape of our towns, our customs, our unspoken rules, still echoing the memory of a sentence no one remembers delivering? Maybe silence itself, not the absence of sound, but the kind that watches, that waits, that follows, because the animals never spoke. Not the pig that stood before the gallows, not the rooster tethered in the dock, not the mule accused of rebellion. They stood, or they were carried, or they were summoned in parchment and imagination, but they never answered, and their silence was never empty. It echoed. It pressed against the walls of the courtroom, against the shoulders of those who bore witness, against the ink that spilled into the records. It made us fill in the blanks, and in filling them, we revealed the most. Their silence forced us to perform both sides of the story. We gave them motives. We gave them temperament. We gave them guilt, not because we saw it, but because we needed to see something. We projected humanity onto them, not in kindness, but in fear. The pig must have intended it. The rooster must have known. The rat must have defied the blessing. And so, their stillness became sinister. Could it be that the trials were never about what the animals did, but about how uncomfortable we were with what we couldn't explain? The child was dead, the harvest ruined, the well fouled. Someone had to speak to that pain. And when no one could, we placed it on the backs of creatures who could not reply. Not because they were guilty, but because they were there, nearby, breathing, watching, unmoved. Maybe the silence of the accused felt like arrogance, or defiance, or worse, indifference. And so we imagined their thoughts. We gave them cunning, spite, mischief. And in doing so, we externalized our own fears, our own impulse toward blame, toward narrative. Because silence makes no promises. Silence offers no resolution. And yet, there was something else in it, too. A stillness that unsettled not just because it was foreign, but because it was familiar. Because we saw in that quiet the way grief feels when it has no language. The way guilt lingers when there's no one to hold it. Maybe the animals were mirrors, not just for superstition, but for the deeper truth we didn't want to name. That suffering often comes without cause. That pain sometimes arrives without reason. And that no verdict can truly untangle it. The animals never flinched at the reading of their crimes, never bowed their heads in shame, never struggled against their sentence. And so, in their silence, we imagined all the things we couldn't bear to sit with alone. And when the execution came, slow, public, formal, the silence thickened. Not just theirs, but the silence in the crowd. The hush that fell as the rope was tightened. The breath held as the verdict was carried out. A silence that didn't ask for justice, but for certainty, for closure, for proof that the story was over. But it never really was, because the silence stayed behind. It clung to the spaces between the words in the court record. It followed the children who passed the execution site on their way to school. It crept back into the barns, into the meadows, into the kitchens where nothing had really changed except the sense that something had been decided, though no one was sure what. And in time, the silence faded into memory, then into myth, then into absence. But its echo shaped us. It shaped how we named wrongness, how we measured guilt, how we looked at others, human and not, and decided who deserved to be heard, and who could be imagined into guilt. Because silence, once feared, is rarely forgotten. And if the silence of the accused forced us to imagine their voices, what else might we still be imagining? Not because we heard it, but because we needed to. Maybe everything. Maybe the whole pageant of guilt and gavel, the solemn procession of roles and rules, was never about the creatures before us, but the shadows within us. Perhaps these were not trials in any ordinary sense, but soft reflections, ceremonies of projection, mirrors held up to the human ache for meaning. Because how else do we explain it? A beetle summoned to court. A rooster asked to account for an egg it was never supposed to lay. A dead man, dressed and seated, facing questions he could no longer hear. These were not acts of governance. They were acts of grief, of bewilderment. When the world became too strange, too quiet, too violent, too cold, we called it to order. Not because it could answer back, but because we needed to believe it might. The courtroom, then, was not a machine of justice, but a lens. Through it, we examined not what had happened, but how we felt about it. The loss, the fear, the crack in the pattern. We needed to contain it, to name it, to wrap it in the form of cause and consequence. And so we chose symbols, the animal, the ghost, the storm cloud, and placed them in our stead. Could it be that we never truly tried pigs or mice or winds, but ourselves? That each absurd sentence, each carefully inked verdict, was a quiet confession, a way of saying, we are scared and we do not understand, and we will do whatever it takes to make the world feel ordered again. And so the courtroom became a mirror, a slow ritual of self-reflection disguised as prosecution. The rooster stood in the dock, but it was our shame we weighed. The weevil was summoned, but it was our own frailty we hoped to exile. The pig was hanged, and for a moment the balance felt restored, not because justice had been done, but because our fear had been heard. Not because it was right, but because it was ritual. And ritual, more than reason, is what holds us when reason slips. There's something almost holy in that, not in the content, but in the cadence. The way the rituals never rushed. The way parchment absorbed belief like breath. The way each absurd trial invited us to sit in our discomfort, to speak it aloud in the only language we had: story, symbol, sentence. Maybe the trials didn't reveal truth, but they revealed something else, something softer, something slower. The way culture calcifies around pain. The way belief reshapes the ground beneath us. The way we pass our confusion down, carved into records and whispered into childhood warnings. And over time, we forget why the goat was blamed, but the fence remains. We forget why the bell rang at noon, but the rope is still there, worn smooth by hands that no longer remember the name of the storm it once rang against. So we build lives in the echo of these verdicts, quiet echoes now, but still real, still shaping how we view danger, how we name the other, how we draw the lines between intention and accident, between who is punished and who is simply endured. And if these strange trials were mirrors all along, how many reflections have we mistaken for reality, simply because we were looking too closely into our own fear? Perhaps the answer lies not in the records, but in what the records became, softened by centuries, carried in voice more than ink, transformed not by lies, but by time. Some of these trials were written down, carefully, officially, in Latin script with seals and signatures and dates that tried to pin chaos into permanence. But most were not remembered for the verdicts. They were remembered for the shape of the story. And stories, unlike verdicts, have their own way of surviving. A pig was once tried for murder. That part may be true. But what people remember is the image of the pig in trousers, or wearing a hat, or led through the square like a knight undone. They remember the children pointing, the old woman crossing herself, the priest who could barely finish the sentence without laughter. The absurdity remains, not as history, but as memory softened into myth. Could it be that this is what we wanted all along? Not the permanence of law, but the comfort of a tale. Something to pass across tables, beside fires, in the lull between seasons. Something that explained the strange without having to resolve it. Because stories allow for wonder, for pause, for revision. A verdict ends something. A story lets it live. And so the beetles that were excommunicated are now told to have left the village politely, 2 by 2. The rooster who laid the cursed egg becomes a creature of prophecy. The weevil becomes a traveler, cursed to wander from parish to parish, always leaving famine in its wake. The facts fade, but the pattern remains. And perhaps, quietly, gently, this is how our oldest laws survive. Not in doctrine, but in fable. Not because the record was strong, but because the story was strange enough to be retold. There's a kind of erosion that time performs not to destroy, but to reveal. Like a carving worn by weather until only the simplest shape remains. Not the details, but the feeling. The echo. The fable beneath the fact. Maybe that's what these stories are now. Echoes of fears we still carry, just dressed in different animals. The rat becomes rumor. The pig becomes blame. The crow becomes omen. The tale gives us something to hold. Not because it's true, but because it has rhythm. Like grief. Like belief. And we've always trusted rhythm more than reason. What if that's how culture survives entropy? Not in what we prove, but in what we retell. What we reshape. What we forget slowly with care. Not because it didn't matter, but because it mattered too much to stay fixed. And so the law becomes folklore. The courtroom becomes a parable. The sentence becomes a symbol. And somewhere between the archive and the campfire, we forget where one ended and the other began. Not because we were careless, but because we were human. And if even the trials of beetles and birds can dissolve in a story, what else might we have mistaken for fable, when it was once, however strangely, our way of remembering what we couldn't understand? Somewhere, not far from the edge of written time, a final case was etched into parchment. A last sigh of an old ritual, not marked with celebration, nor regret. Simply done. We do not know the animal. Not for certain. Perhaps it was a pig again. Or a goat, too old and too near crime. Perhaps it was something smaller, a cat with the wrong eyes, or a bird that landed on the wrong shoulder. We know only that there was a trial, that someone stood on behalf of the law, and something, stood accused. No herald rang the end. No chronicler wrote, "This was the last." It faded not with ceremony, but with silence, like snow melting unnoticed at the edge of a wood. The custom, once so serious, so solemn, so tangled in robes and Latin and belief, was suddenly too absurd, too old, too fragile to carry forward. And yet, for centuries, it had carried us. Could it be that in placing beasts on trial, we had kept something older than law alive? Something sacred, though strange? Not because we believed the pig could reason, not because we thought the rat understood the sentence, but because in those rituals, those peculiar, poetic, impossible proceedings, we spoke to the world as if it, too, had a soul. Maybe that was the point. Not the verdict, but the gesture. To name the wrong, to ask it why, even if it could not answer. To see the wind or worm or weevil not as chaos, but as a participant in our shared, fragile order. And when we stopped, when the last feathered defendant was no longer summoned, when the final hoofprint was washed from the courtroom floor, maybe something else dimmed. Not reason, not progress, but reverence. Because in a strange way, these trials had kept the world alive with meaning. Every squeak and rustle, every failed harvest and spotted leaf could still be spoken to, accused, warned, forgiven. The world was not silent then. It was full of small responsibilities, shared burdens, interwoven roles. And when we stopped, we replaced ritual with rule, mystery with method, not because we had outgrown the stories, but because we had forgotten how to listen to them. Was the last trial held on a wet morning? Did the magistrate sigh as he read the sentence? Did anyone, for even a flicker of a moment, realize they were closing a chapter that had begun before memory? We will never know. The ink fades. The paper yellows. The name of the village dissolves into dust. But the echo remains, not in books, but in the shape of the question. When it ended, did something sacred go quiet? And yet, if even silence holds echoes, what might we still be hearing, without knowing, from that final judgment rendered to the voiceless? The roads have changed. The candles no longer flicker against wooden walls stained by incense. Latin is gone, traded for the firm cadence of modern code. And still, beneath polished benches, beneath the marble, beneath the protocol, something hums. Something old, something strangely familiar. We do not lead cows through the doors of our courthouses. We do not read verdicts to mice. But we still build narratives around those who cannot speak for themselves. We still render judgment in the absence of understanding. Not because we must, but because we need the comfort of order. There's a quiet hunger in us to explain the chaos. When a tragedy arrives, sudden, senseless, we seek the shape of a culprit. If it cannot be found, we carve one for metaphor. A foreign hand, a strange behavior, a mistake made by something not like us. The beast is still there. It simply wears a different skin. Could it be that the ghosts of those early trials still thread through our jurisprudence? Maybe, maybe not. But every time a law is written to restrain not danger, but discomfort, every time a punishment is passed to make sense of the senseless, the whisper of the old courtroom returns. Once, it was a weevil blamed for famine. Today, it might be a child blamed for disruption. Once, a pig punished for a child's death. Now, a system engineered to utter what it cannot predict. Not because we are cruel, but because we are afraid. Afraid of entropy, of randomness, of the thought that suffering might come without cause. The architecture of blame has evolved, but the blueprint was drafted long ago by hands that believed the world was alive with will, and therefore must be answerable. And what are corporations? Legal persons without breath, without thought. Entities summoned from ink and infrastructure, sued, defended, fined. We call them they. We bind them in law. But they do not speak. They do not feel. They are structures made animate by our belief, like the goats of old, made subjects of the court by ritual and projection. What if the old trials were not primitive relics, but rehearsals? Not because they were wise, but because they were necessary precursors. Maybe the pig in the docket taught us how to abstract guilt, how to assign it to symbols. And once learned, we never unlearned it. There is beauty in that, and tragedy too, because when guilt becomes a shape that can be draped on anything, it also becomes easier to forget the human behind the shape, the child behind the mistake, the stranger behind the fear, the past behind the law. And so we build systems, complex, towering, immaculate, to measure intent. But beneath it all, there's still the soft animal instinct. Something went wrong. Something must pay. It is less a sentence than a song, one sung for centuries, one we are still humming, even as we believe ourselves silent. And in the margins of modern courtrooms, in footnotes, in procedural quirks, in rhetorical habits, we find fossils. Phrases like standing, rituals of address, echoes of incantation, structures that began not in logic, but in belief. Not because they made sense, but because they felt sacred. What else lies embedded in the floorboards of justice? Could it be that the absurd animal trials gave us more than amusement or horror? That they left behind the muscle memory of collective reckoning? A choreography of blame and atonement? Not precise, not fair, but shared. Maybe that is what persists. Not the belief that a pig can sin, but the shared need to name something guilty even when the world resists all naming. And yet, if we can recognize that echo, might we learn to hear it differently? To soften it? To ask not only what is to blame, but what is missing, forgotten, unseen? Because in the deepest archives of law, there are silences, too. Gaps where voices should have been. Records scorched by time or by choice. Cultures erased. Defendants misunderstood. Rulings that linger like shadows. Maybe justice is not built solely on precedent, but on memory. And memory, we know, is porous. So we press forward, believing we have outgrown the past, that our laws are now pure structure. But the bones of old rituals still hold up the weight, quietly, invisibly, like beams hidden behind plaster. And if the absurd past still shapes the present logic, what might the present logic become tomorrow? And if this much can be traced back, to feather, to hoof, to claw, what else might be shaping us, even now, without our knowing? In the hush between midnight and morning, when the earth forgets the urgency of day, there lingers a deeper silence, not of stillness, but of things unsaid. In that silence, guilt becomes a strange and weightless thing. It has no language, no teeth, no fixed place to sit, and yet it settles on shoulders, in towns, across centuries. Somewhere, beneath the soil of a forgotten village, lies a broken pen beside the remains of a courthouse wall. Not because it was buried with care, but because time is careless. Rain collapses parchment. Roots pierce memory. The law erodes, but the shape of its questions remain. What is guilt when there is no one left to name it? There are places, valleys swept by wind, forests thick with the green breath of centuries, where guilt never had a voice to begin with, where judgment was whispered through weather or etched in the pattern of animal tracks, where harm was felt but never litigated. And in those places, the sky bore witness but did not speak. Could it be that justice, in its first and final form, was never about outcome? That it was not about punishing what had happened, but about holding on to something that could make the happening bearable? Maybe, maybe not. But the urge to assign fault, even when no voice can answer back, seems older than any written code. We see it in the way a grieving family blames the wind, in the way famine is blamed on blight, and blight on spirits, and spirits on the habits of unseen beasts. Not because we are foolish, but because we are small, because meaning is the only shelter we have against the vast, soft collapse of reason. And perhaps that is why we once judged animals, why we shouted verdicts of the sky, why we sat in silence, staring at a lifeless body and asked it to confess. These are not errors. These are not madness. They were attempts, tender, flawed, desperate, to draw lines around grief. And yet, the lines never held. Even now, beneath the mechanisms of modern law, something older still flickers. The unspoken desire to find the story. Not the truth, necessarily, but the narrative that makes the ache explainable. And when the world offers no story, we invent one. A rooster near the fire becomes the cause of it. A fox near the coop becomes the reason for hunger. A child with strange eyes becomes the harbinger of misfortune. Not because they are guilty, but because without a shape, sorrow is unbearable. In the ancient cities whose names crumble in our mouths, Ugarit, Ebla, Mohenjo-daro, tablets still whisper of oaths taken under moonlight, of floods punished with sacrifice, of silence met with ritual. Their laws do not live, but their longing does. And perhaps that is what remains when all else is gone. Not guilt, but the wish to name it. In some old churches, tucked behind altars, there are carvings no one prays to anymore. A goat with chained feet, a man with a mouse beneath his heel. They are not gods. They are not saints. They are echoes, shadows of a time when judgment stretched beyond speech, when wrongness was not something done, but something felt. And now we sit in rooms flooded with fluorescent light, speaking of liability and burden of proof. We write reports. We calculate loss. But in the spaces between paragraphs, the same ancient question stirs. Why did this happen? And when no answer comes, we do what we have always done. We tell a story, not because it is accurate, but because it is necessary. And maybe, just maybe, this is not a flaw in our nature, but its most sacred offering. Maybe justice was never about clarity. Maybe it was, and still is, a ritual for mourning. A way to wrap grief in structure, to dress absence in robes. And what are the voiceless? The animals, the dead, the forgotten, the blamed. They did not speak, but we imagine their voices, their arguments, their defiance, or their shame. We projected onto them not because we believed they could answer, but because we needed to hear ourselves. What remains, then, of guilt in a world without voice? Only what we carry, only what we choose to remember. And if memory, too, falters, if names blur, if records burn, if trials melt into myth, then maybe guilt becomes not a verdict, but a question we keep asking, softly, without end. And yet, if this much can be remembered, even in fragments, what else might still live, quiet, buried, waiting in the stories we once told of the silence?